The glass in my hand caught the amber glow of the rooftop lights as Daniel's laughter rang out across the table, easy and careless, the kind of sound that makes other people want to join in even when they don't understand the joke. 20 faces turned toward us. Colleagues whose approval he courted like oxygen. Clients whose money kept our lifestyle polished and comfortable. Friends who existed in that strange middle space where affection and networking blur into something transactional. Well, Emily was my youthful mistake before I really figured life out. The words landed with the weight of something rehearsed, practiced in his mind, until they felt clever enough to deploy. He lifted his wine glass higher, his smile broad and confident, and waited for the laughter he'd earned through 8 years of carefully cultivated charm. A few people did laugh, short, uncertain sounds that died quickly when they registered my face, or rather, my lack of reaction. I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp or let my expression crack into hurt or rage or any of the emotions currently shredding through my chest like broken glass. I simply raised my own glass, brought it to my lips, and took a slow, deliberate sip of wine that tasted like ash and clarity. The silence stretched. Someone coughed. A woman across the table, Jennifer, Daniel's colleague who always complimented my earrings with a hint of pity in her voice, looked down at her plate as though she'd discovered something fascinating in the grilled salmon. Daniel's smile wavered. Just slightly. Just enough that I saw the moment he realized his joke hadn't landed the way he'd wanted. That the room had gone cold instead of warm. That he'd miscalculated, but he recovered quickly, as he always did, pivoting to a story about a difficult client and letting the conversation shift away from us like water flowing around a stone. I sat there in my black dress, the one he'd bought me last Christmas and said made me look elegant enough for his world, and felt something inside me go quiet. Not broken, not shattered, just still. Absolutely, perfectly still. It wasn't the first time Daniel had used me as a punchline. Over 8 years, I'd learned to recognize the pattern. A small jab disguised as affection, a dismissive comment wrapped in humor. My accomplishments minimized while his expanded to fill every available space. But this was different. This was public. This was deliberate. This was him telling 20 people whose opinions mattered to him that I was a mistake he'd outgrown and expecting me to smile through it because that's what I always did. The thing about being underestimated is that people stop watching you carefully. They assume your silence means acceptance. They mistake composure for weakness, stillness for passivity. Daniel had spent 8 years teaching me to be small, to take up less space, to let his voice be the loudest in any room. What he didn't realize was that in all those years of watching him, studying him, learning the architecture of his ego and the fault lines in his carefully constructed image, I'd become very, very good at waiting. The rest of the dinner blurred into a performance I'd perfected, smiling at the right moments, nodding when appropriate, asking polite questions that made other people feel heard while revealing nothing of the calculation running beneath my surface. Daniel touched my shoulder twice, proprietary gestures that said, "Mine to the room," and I let him. I even leaned into it slightly, the picture of a devoted wife who found her husband's confidence attractive rather than suffocating. When we finally left, Daniel pressing his hand against my lower back as we said our goodbyes, his fingers a gentle pressure that felt like ownership, I walked beside him to the car without speaking. The night air was cool against my skin, carrying the faint smell of the lake and exhaust from Michigan Avenue. Chicago sparkled around us, indifferent and glittering. "That was a good night," Daniel said as he unlocked the car, his voice satisfied. "Thompson said he's ready to close on the River North property. That's $3 million in commission." "Congratulations," I said, My voice sounded normal. Warm, even. He glanced at me as we pulled into traffic, and I saw the moment he remembered his joke. "You're not upset about what I said earlier, are you? It was just, people were laughing, and you know how those things are. It's all in good fun." I looked out the window at the passing lights. "I'm not upset." "You seem upset." His tone shifted, taking on that edge I knew meant he was preparing to be annoyed with me. "You barely said anything the rest of the night. People probably thought something was wrong." "Nothing's wrong, Daniel." "You're doing that thing where you say one thing and mean another. It's exhausting." He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, a gesture of irritation. "I work hard to build relationships with these people. The least you could do is not make things awkward by shutting down and making it about your feelings." I turned to look at him then, studying his profile in the intermittent glow of streetlights. The sharp line of his jaw, the way his hair was starting to thin at the temples, though he'd never admit it. The expensive watch on his wrist that he'd bought himself after his last big sale, celebrating an achievement he'd credited entirely to his own brilliance, despite the hundreds of hours I'd spent supporting, encouraging, hosting dinner parties, making connections, being the perfect accessory to his ambition. "You're right," I said quietly. "I'm sorry." His shoulders relaxed. "I just don't want to fight tonight. Let's go home and forget about it." Home. The word felt strange in my mouth, like something that belonged to someone else's life. We drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before. Daniel thought it meant I'd accepted his dismissal, that we were returning to normal. What he didn't hear was the sound of every lock inside me clicking shut, one by one, until nothing he could say or do would ever reach the parts of me that had, until tonight, still hoped he might see me as something other than a youthful mistake he'd learned to tolerate. When we got home, the sleek downtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the place that always felt more like a showroom than a home, Daniel poured himself a scotch and collapsed onto the leather sofa, already scrolling through his phone. "I'm going to shower," I said. He didn't look up. "Okay, don't be too long. I want to watch that documentary about the Chicago architecture." I walked into our bedroom, the space we'd shared for 8 years, and looked at it with new eyes. Everything was expensive and carefully chosen. The king bed with its designer bedding, the matching nightstands, the abstract art on the walls that Daniel had selected because it made a statement. My things existed here only in the margins, a book on the nightstand, a framed photo of my parents that Daniel always said didn't match the aesthetic, the modest jewelry box containing pieces I'd inherited from my grandmother. I moved quietly, efficiently, pulling a suitcase from the closet. The sound of Daniel's documentary drifted from the living room, a narrator discussing Louis Sullivan and the birth of the skyscraper. I packed quickly, clothes, toiletries, documents I'd need, the few items that actually mattered to me. Everything fit into one medium-sized suitcase and a shoulder bag. 8 years of marriage, and the things I cared enough to take with me barely filled 2 pieces of luggage. The apartment my aunt had left me 3 years ago sat empty across town, a small 1-bedroom in a neighborhood Daniel had dismissed as charming but impractical. I'd kept paying the utilities, telling Daniel it was because I couldn't bring myself to sell it yet, letting him believe my sentimentality was just another example of my inability to make hard business decisions. In truth, I'd always known I might need somewhere that belonged only to me, a space he couldn't touch or claim or minimize. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a moment, looking at Daniel's back as he sat absorbed in his documentary, drink in hand, completely unaware that I was about to walk out of his life. Part of me wanted to confront him, to deliver a speech about respect and dignity, and all the ways he'd slowly eroded both. But I'd learned something important over 8 years. Daniel didn't hear words that threatened his self-image. He deflected, minimized, turned criticism into my oversensitivity, my inability to take a joke, my failure to understand how the real world worked. So I said nothing. I simply picked up my suitcase and bag, walked quietly to the front door, and left. The sound of the lock clicking behind me felt like the first full breath I'd taken in years. The apartment was dark and cool when I arrived, carrying the faint mustiness of a place that had been empty too long. I turned on lights, opened windows, and stood in the middle of the small living room feeling something I hadn't expected: peace. Not relief, not triumph, just a deep settling peace that came from being in a space where no one was monitoring my expression, weighing my words, deciding whether my emotions were justified or excessive. I made up the bed with sheets I'd stored in the closet, poured myself a glass of water, and lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. My phone buzzed once, a text from Daniel asking where the remote was, and I turned it face down on the nightstand. Tomorrow, everything would explode. Tomorrow, there would be phone calls and demands, and probably anger that would dwarf anything I'd seen from him before. But tonight, I slept more deeply than I had in months. My body finally releasing the tension it had been carrying like armor. I woke at dawn, that blue-gray hour before the city fully stirs, and knew exactly what I needed to do. Daniel had called me his youthful mistake in front of 20 people who mattered to his career, his reputation, his carefully cultivated image as someone who'd climbed from middle-class roots to Chicago's real estate elite through charm and skill. He'd used me as a punchline, and worse, he'd assumed I would absorb the humiliation and move on because that's what I always did. What he didn't understand was that I'd been keeping a different kind of accounting than he realized. Not out of malice, but out of survival. The same instinct that made me memorize his patterns, anticipate his moods, become fluent in the unspoken language of his expectations. I drove back to our apartment as the sun was rising, the streets nearly empty except for delivery trucks and early commuters. I still had my keys. I still knew his routines. And I knew that after a night of drinking and self-congratulation, Daniel would sleep until at least 9, probably later. The apartment was silent when I entered. His Scotch glass sat on the coffee table, the documentary still paused on the television. I moved through the space like a ghost, gathering the few remaining items I wanted. My grandmother's jewelry box, the photo albums my mother had made, the small painting I'd bought at a street fair before I met Daniel, back when I still trusted my own taste. Then I went to the bathroom, our bathroom, with its marble counters and expensive fixtures, and the mirror where Daniel checked his appearance every morning before facing the world he was determined to conquer. I found the lipstick in the drawer where I'd left it months ago, pushed to the back behind products I actually used. Daniel had bought it for me early in our marriage, a bold red he'd said would look dramatic and confident on me. When I'd actually worn it, he'd laughed and said I looked like I was trying too hard. That subtle was more my speed. The tube had sat unused ever since, a small monument to his ability to give with one hand and take with the other. I uncapped it and began to write. The words came easily, each letter precise and deliberate. I took my time, making sure the message was clear, readable, impossible to misinterpret. This wasn't a moment for ambiguity or metaphor. This was a moment for truth. When I finished, I stepped back and looked at what I'd written. The red lipstick stood out starkly against the mirror, bright and undeniable. Not cruel, but factual. Not vindictive, but honest. Words that would force Daniel to see, really see, what he'd been doing for 8 years, how his casual cruelty had accumulated into something that could no longer be laughed off or dismissed. I placed my keys on the kitchen counter, aligned them neatly beside the coffee maker that I'd used every morning to make him the dark roast he preferred. Then I walked out, closing the door softly behind me, and got into my car as the city was beginning to wake up around me. I drove to a small cafe 3 blocks from my aunt's apartment, ordered coffee, and sat by the window. Watching people pass, commuters heading to offices, parents walking children to school, the beautiful, ordinary rhythm of a city in motion. My phone sat on the table in front of me, silent. It started buzzing at 9:47 a.m. Daniel's name flashed across the screen. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail, then ring again, and again. I sipped my coffee, a luxuriously good pour-over that I'd ordered without thinking about the price, without calculating whether it was frivolous or justified, and counted the calls. 4, 7, 12. Between calls, texts started appearing. "Where are you? Emily, this isn't funny? Call me immediately. Emily, what the hell did you do?" By the 15th call, I could imagine exactly what was happening. Daniel waking up alone, calling my name with increasing irritation. Checking the bedroom, the living room, noticing my things were gone. The moment of confusion giving way to anger. Walking into the bathroom, perhaps to splash water on his face, or take the ibuprofen he'd need after last night's drinking, and then freezing. Seeing the words I'd left for him, written in the lipstick he'd bought me, and then mocked me for wearing. Impossible to miss. Impossible to dismiss. I turned my phone over and ordered a second coffee. The calls continued. 20, 25. Voicemails filled my inbox with increasing urgency. Confusion, then anger, then something that might have been panic. I didn't listen to them. Not yet. That would come later, when I needed to understand exactly how he was framing this, what narrative he was constructing to protect himself. At noon, the texts changed tone. "Emily, please. We need to talk. I know you're upset, but this is extreme. Where are you? I'm worried. Just tell me you're safe." The shift from anger to concern was calculated, I knew. Daniel was smart enough to realize that aggression wouldn't work if I'd truly left, that he needed to reposition himself as the worried husband, rather than the man who'd publicly called his wife his biggest mistake. But the calculation itself was revealing. Even now, even in what should have been a moment of genuine reflection, he was strategizing. I paid for my coffee, left a generous tip, and walked back to the apartment. My apartment now, the space that was mine alone. I unpacked my suitcase, hung up my clothes, arranged my grandmother's jewelry box on the dresser. The painting I'd bought before Daniel went on the wall across from the bed. Slowly, methodically, I began transforming the empty space into something that reflected who I'd been before I learned to shrink myself. The phone continued buzzing. I turned off the ringer. Around 2 p.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door, then insistent knocking. "Emily. Emily, I know you're in there. Open the door." Daniel's voice carried that edge of controlled anger he used when he was trying not to lose his temper publicly, aware that neighbors might hear, that maintaining appearances mattered even, especially, when everything was falling apart. I sat on my bed, perfectly still, and waited. "Emily, this is ridiculous. We need to talk like adults." More knocking. "I'm not leaving until you open this door." I picked up my phone, typed a message, and sent it. "Leave. If you're still there in 5 minutes, I'm calling the police." The knocking stopped. Through the door, I heard him swear under his breath. Then footsteps retreating down the hall. I waited 30 minutes before I allowed myself to move, to breathe normally, to acknowledge the adrenaline shaking through my hands. This was just the beginning. Daniel didn't accept defeat easily. He'd regroup, recalculate, come at this from another angle. But for now, I had space. I had silence. I had the freedom to think without his presence filling every corner of the room. That night, I cooked myself dinner, a simple pasta with vegetables that Daniel would have dismissed as bachelor food, and ate it slowly, tasting every bite. I opened a bottle of wine I'd bought months ago and never opened because Daniel preferred scotch and had opinions about my wine choices. I sat by the window and watched the city lights come on as darkness fell, feeling the weight of 8 years slowly beginning to lift. My phone buzzed again around 9 p.m. A text from Jennifer, Daniel's colleague from last night. "Hey, hope you're okay. What happened at dinner was really uncomfortable. Let me know if you need anything." I stared at the message for a long time. Jennifer, who'd laughed at Daniel's jokes for years, who'd watched him dismiss me repeatedly and said nothing, who was reaching out now not out of friendship but out of curiosity, wanting to be included in whatever drama was unfolding. I deleted the text without responding. At 11 p.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, curious. "Mrs. Carter, this is Susan Chen. I'm an attorney. Your husband contacted my office today requesting legal counsel regarding a potential separation. I wanted to reach out directly before taking him on as a client, as it's my practice to speak with both parties when possible in these situations." I sat up straighter. "My husband hired a divorce attorney?" "He's exploring his options. I wanted to make sure you're aware of your rights and have proper representation. Do you have a lawyer?" "Not yet. I'd recommend getting one soon. Mr. Carter was quite detailed about his concerns regarding asset division." Something cold settled in my stomach. "What concerns?" "I can't discuss specifics without violating attorney-client privilege, but I will say this. Make sure you have copies of all financial documents, account statements, property records, everything. Sooner rather than later." The line went dead. I sat in the dark apartment, Susan Chen's warning echoing in my mind. Daniel had gone straight to a lawyer. Not to therapy, not to counseling, not to any attempt at understanding why I'd left. Straight to asset protection, to making sure that whatever happened next, he'd come out ahead financially. It shouldn't have surprised me. It was exactly who he was, calculating, strategic, always 3 moves ahead when it came to protecting his interests. But it still stung. The confirmation that even now, even after 8 years, his first instinct was to treat our marriage as a business deal gone bad, rather than a relationship worth fighting for. I opened my laptop and began making a list of everything I needed to do. Bank accounts, property records, tax returns, the title to my car. Documentation of my own income from my physical therapy practice, which I'd kept separate from Daniel's real estate money at his insistence. He'd always said it was better to keep things clean, that my income was too small to matter much anyway. At the time, I'd felt diminished by that assessment. Now I understood it had been protection. By midnight, I'd started downloading and organizing 8 years of financial records. By 2 a.m., I had copies of everything stored in 3 separate locations. Cloud storage, a USB drive, and printed copies locked in a safe deposit box I'd opened years ago after my aunt died. Ostensibly for her jewelry, but really because I'd wanted something Daniel couldn't access. By 3 a.m., I drafted an email to 3 divorce attorneys whose names I'd found through careful research, requesting consultations. By 4 a.m., I finally fell asleep, my laptop still glowing beside me. My phone silent except for the continuous ignored buzzing of Daniel's calls. The next morning, I woke to 53 missed calls and 38 text messages. I made coffee, sat at my small kitchen table, and finally began listening to the voicemails. The first ones were anger. "Where the hell are you? This is insane. You can't just leave without talking to me." The middle ones shifted to bargaining. "I'm sorry about what I said. I was drunk. Let me make it up to you. Come home and we'll figure this out. I know I mess up sometimes, but we can work on this." The most recent ones carried something new in Daniel's voice: uncertainty. "Emily, please, I don't understand what's happening. Just call me back." A pause. "I read what you wrote. We need to talk about it." Another pause. Longer. "I miss you." I deleted them all and moved to the text messages. Most were variations of the voicemails, but one stood out, sent at 3:47 a.m. "I showed Thompson your message about the dates you wrote. He says I need to apologize. He says I've been an ass and didn't realize it. He's probably right. I'm sorry, Emily. Really sorry. Can we please talk?" I read it 3 times, feeling something twist in my chest. Daniel had shown someone what I'd written on the mirror. He'd taken something private, something raw, and turned it into a consultation with his colleague, treating our marriage like another deal that needed strategic advice. The apology itself was empty, performative, the kind of thing he'd say to close a difficult transaction. I put down the phone and looked around the apartment. Sunlight was streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. Everything was quiet. Everything was mine. For the first time in 8 years, no one was going to walk through the door and fill the space with their presence, their expectations, their need for me to be smaller. My phone rang. Daniel again. This time, I answered. "Emily." His voice was raw with exhaustion. "Finally. Jesus Christ, where have you been?" "I've been here." "Where is here?" "I went to your aunt's place yesterday, but you wouldn't open the door. I've been calling you for—" "I know how many times you've called, Daniel." A pause. "Can we please talk? In person? I'll come wherever you are." "No." "Emily, what did you write on the mirror?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Tell me exactly what you read." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone was careful, measured. "You wrote that I didn't make a youthful mistake. I made a choice, and that this was your choice, and then you listed 3 dates. What were the dates?" I'm not sure what they all mean. One was from 2 years ago, that anniversary dinner I couldn't make because of the Miami closing. One was, I think it was that time at your parents' house when I made that joke about your mom's cooking. And the third? Last night, the rooftop dinner. His voice dropped. "Emily, I was drunk. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." I kept my tone neutral, factual. "You meant it. You've been meaning it for years. The only difference is last night you said it out loud in front of people." "That's not fair. I was trying to be funny. Everyone makes jokes about their spouse. 3 dates, Daniel. 3 moments when you made a choice to humiliate me or dismiss me or treat me like I didn't matter. There were dozens more I could have written, but I only had space for 3. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Silence. "Do you?" I pressed. "You're saying I've been a bad husband." His voice had gone flat. "Okay, fine. I accept that. I should have been better. But running away in the middle of the night and writing cryptic messages on the mirror? That's not how adults handle problems." And there it was. The pivot I'd been waiting for. The moment when my justified response became the problem. When Daniel transformed himself from perpetrator to victim of my excessive reaction. "You're right," I said quietly. Adults handle problems by discussing them, by listening when their partner says something hurts, by noticing patterns of behavior and choosing to change. How many times over 8 years did I try to tell you how your jokes made me feel? How many times did you dismiss it as me being too sensitive? I don't remember. 17 times, Daniel. I counted. 17 separate conversations where I tried to explain that being the punchline of your humor was eroding something essential in me, and 17 times you told me I was overreacting or misunderstanding or needed to develop a thicker skin. So yes, I stopped trying to use words. Words didn't work with you. You only hear things that confirm what you already believe. That's not true. Then tell me something you've learned about me in the last 2 years. Something I care about. Something that matters to me. Something I've shared with you that has nothing to do with your needs or your career or your image. The silence stretched out, filled with the weight of 8 years of one-sided attention. You like your work, he finally said. You care about your patients. I quit my job 6 months ago to start my own private practice. You didn't notice. You what? I've been working out of a small office in Lakeview, building my own client base, making my own decisions about treatment approaches and scheduling. It's been the most fulfilling work of my life, and you didn't notice because you never asked about my day, unless it affected yours. I could hear him breathing, could almost see him processing this information, recalibrating his understanding of the situation. Emily, if I didn't pay enough attention, I'm filing for divorce, I said, cutting through whatever script he was preparing. Papers will be served to you within the week. My attorney will contact yours to discuss asset division. This conversation is me extending you the courtesy of hearing it from me directly rather than from a process server. Wait, hold on. You can't just... We've been married 8 years. You can't throw that away because I made one stupid joke? It wasn't one joke. It was 8 years of small cuts that you told me weren't bleeding. But I'm done trying to convince you that the wounds were real. I'm done explaining myself. I'm done being the mistake you learned from. Emily, please, let's go to counseling. Let's work on this. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't give up on us. Something in his voice caught, genuine emotion breaking through the strategy. For just a moment, I heard the man I'd married at 26, the one who'd been charming and attentive in the beginning, before success and ego had calcified into something harder. The time for counseling was 3 years ago when I first suggested it. I said gently. You told me we didn't need a therapist to tell us what we already knew. Do you remember that? I was wrong. Yes, you were. But I can't fix this for both of us anymore, Daniel. I can't want the marriage to work hard enough to make up for you not wanting it enough to change. That's not how this works. So that's it? 8 years and you're just done? I've been done for longer than you know. Last night was just the moment I finally admitted it to myself. I ended the call before he could respond, before my resolve could weaken, before the familiar pattern of his need pulling at my empathy could drag me back into a conversation that went in circles. The phone immediately started ringing again. I powered it off and sat in the sudden silence, feeling the enormousness of what I'd just done settle over me like a heavy coat. The attorney I hired was named Rebecca Walsh, a sharp woman in her 50s, who'd built her practice on high-conflict divorces involving complex asset division. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes in precise handwriting, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she looked up. Your husband hired Marcus Chen. Should I know that name? He's excellent, aggressive. Very good at finding hidden assets and protecting client interests. The fact that Daniel hired him immediately tells me he's taking this seriously as a financial negotiation, rather than an emotional dissolution. That sounds like him? Good. It makes things cleaner. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. Now, tell me about your private practice. How much of your current income is documented? I walked her through my finances, modest compared to Daniel's real estate money, but entirely mine, built from my own skills and relationships with patients who trusted me. Rebecca asked pointed questions about the apartment I'd inherited, whether Daniel had contributed to its maintenance, whether he had any claim to it. The answer was no on all counts. I'd kept it separate, paid for everything myself, maintained it as a truly independent asset. Smart, Rebecca said. Now, the marital apartment downtown, that's jointly owned? Technically, but Daniel put down the down payment from money he made before we married. He's always been very clear that he sees it as his property. Doesn't matter. If it was purchased during the marriage and both your names are on the deed, it's marital property. You're entitled to half its value. I don't want it. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. It's worth approximately $1.2 million based on current market rates. You're entitled to $600,000. I don't want his money. I just want out. Mrs. Carter, Emily, I understand the emotional urge to walk away clean, but practically speaking, you're entitled to compensation for 8 years of marriage. Whatever you feel about your husband's behavior, the law recognizes that marriage is an economic partnership. You supported his career, hosted events, maintained his household, sacrificed advancement in your own career to accommodate his schedule. That has value. I thought about the dinner parties I'd organized, the clients I'd entertained, the times I'd rearranged my work schedule because Daniel needed me at some function. The invisible labor of being the perfect wife to an ambitious man. Fine, I said. But I want this done quickly. No drawn-out court battles. I'll be reasonable about division if he is. Rebecca smiled slightly. We'll see how reasonable Marcus lets him be. The papers were served to Daniel at his office 3 days later. I know because Jennifer, still fishing for drama, sent me a text. Just so you know, some guy in a suit just handed D papers in front of everyone at the morning meeting. He looked like he wanted to murder someone. Are you okay? I didn't respond, but I did allow myself a small smile. Daniel, who valued his professional image above almost everything, had just been publicly served divorce papers in front of his colleagues. The man who'd called me his youthful mistake in front of 20 people now had to explain to those same people why his wife was leaving him. The phone calls intensified that evening, not from Daniel, who'd apparently learned they were pointless, but from mutual friends. People I hadn't heard from in months suddenly deeply concerned about my well-being, offering to mediate, suggesting we were being too hasty, insisting that every marriage had rough patches. Did Daniel ask you to call me? I asked Sarah, a woman I'd once considered a genuine friend before I realized her loyalty was entirely to Daniel's success. What? No, I'm calling because I care about you both. Did he tell you what he said to me at the rooftop dinner? A pause. He said there was a misunderstanding, that you took a joke the wrong way. He called me his youthful mistake in front of everyone and laughed. That's not a misunderstanding. That's exactly what he meant. Emily, you know how Daniel is. He doesn't think before he speaks sometimes. But he's devastated right now. Completely falling apart. Then maybe he should have thought before he spoke. I ended that call too, and the next one, and the one after that. Each conversation followed the same script. Minimize Daniel's behavior, center his feelings, question my judgment. No one asked what I needed. No one asked what 8 years had actually been like. They just wanted the disruption to stop, wanted everything to return to normal, wanted me to be reasonable and forgiving and small again. Only one person surprised me. Daniel's mother called on a Friday evening. Margaret Carter, a formidable woman who'd built her own successful career as a surgeon, and who I'd always found intimidating and slightly cold. "Emily," her voice was crisp. "I'm calling about the divorce." "Mrs. Carter?" "Margaret, please. We've been family for 8 years." A pause. "Daniel told me what he said at that dinner party." I waited, bracing for judgment. "He also told me what you wrote on the mirror. The 3 dates." Margaret's voice softened slightly. "Emily, I'm calling to tell you that I understand why you're leaving him, and I support your decision." I sat down slowly, surprised into silence. "My son is brilliant in many ways," Margaret continued, "but he inherited his father's blind spot when it comes to respecting his partner. It took me 25 years to leave my husband, and I've regretted every year I waited. Don't make the same mistake I did." Thank you. I didn't expect—" "I know. Daniel probably told you I'd be angry with you. But I've watched him treat you the same way his father treated me, and I've stayed silent because I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I'm sorry for that. You deserved better from him, and you deserved better from me." Something in my chest loosened, a knot I hadn't realized I was carrying. "That means more than you know. Daniel is a good person in many ways, but he's also spoiled and arrogant and convinced that his success justifies his behavior. You leaving might be the best thing that ever happens to him, or it might not. Either way, that's not your responsibility anymore. Take care of yourself, Emily. Build the life you deserve." After we hung up, I cried for the first time since leaving. Not from sadness, but from the unexpected grace of being seen, being understood, being validated by someone who had no reason to take my side, except that it was the right thing to do. The divorce negotiations were exactly as complex as Rebecca had predicted. Daniel's attorney fought every line item, questioned every expense, demanded documentation for every claim. Daniel himself sent emails at odd hours, sometimes conciliatory, sometimes angry, always verbose, always trying to convince me that we were making a mistake. I stopped reading them after the first dozen. Rebecca handled the legal logistics, and I focused on rebuilding my life. My private practice was growing. Patients who'd heard about my skills through word of mouth filled my schedule. I specialized in working with people recovering from accidents and surgeries, helping them rebuild strength and confidence, teaching them that healing was possible even when the damage seemed permanent. The irony wasn't lost on me. I repainted the apartment walls a warm gray that caught the morning light beautifully. I bought furniture that I actually liked instead of pieces chosen for aesthetic cohesion. I hung photos of my friends, my parents, places I'd traveled before meeting Daniel. Slowly, the space transformed from a temporary refuge into an actual home. 3 months after I'd left, I ran into Daniel at a coffee shop near my office. He was at a table with a woman I didn't recognize, both of them leaning over a laptop showing property listings. He looked thinner, tired, his hair disheveled in a way he never would have allowed before. Our eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he stood up, said something to the woman, and walked over. "Emily." "Daniel." We stood there in the awkward space between strangers and people who once knew everything about each other. "You look good," he said finally. "Different, but good." "Thank you." I wanted to apologize. For real this time, not just because my lawyer told me to. What I said at that dinner was cruel. What I did for years before that was worse. You were right about all of it. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or strategy. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected. Genuine regret. "I'm seeing a therapist," he continued, 3 times a week. trying to figure out why I needed to make you small to feel big. It's not an excuse, but I wanted you to know I'm working on it. That's good, Daniel. I hope it helps you. The divorce will be final next month. Marcus says you've been more than fair in the settlement. More than I deserved. I just want it done. He nodded, looked down at his coffee. For what it's worth, you leaving was the best thing that could have happened to me. I know that sounds insane, but it's true. I was turning into someone I didn't recognize. Or maybe I was always that person, and you leaving forced me to see it. I think people are capable of change when they want to be. I said carefully. I'm glad you're trying. I hope. He paused, seemed to reconsider whatever he was going to say. I hope you find someone who treats you the way you deserve. Someone who sees how lucky they are every single day. There was no bitterness in his voice, no hidden agenda. Just honest acknowledgement of what he'd lost and why. Take care of yourself, Daniel. You too, Emily. I walked out of the coffee shop and into the bright afternoon, feeling something close to closure. Not forgiveness, he'd have to earn that from himself, not from me, but a sense that the chapter was finally, truly over. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in April. No dramatic courtroom scene, no last-minute revelations. Just a judge's signature and 8 years legally dissolved into paperwork. Rebecca called to tell me it was done, asked if I wanted to celebrate, and seemed surprised when I declined. I wasn't interested in celebrating the end of my marriage. I was interested in building the beginning of whatever came next. That evening, I sat in my apartment, my home, and thought about the woman who'd walked out with one suitcase and a message written in lipstick. About the silence that had become my weapon when words failed. About the choice to value my dignity more than my fear of being alone. What surprised me most wasn't that I'd left. It was how long I'd stayed. How many years I'd spent believing that love meant endurance, that commitment meant accepting the unacceptable, that leaving meant failure. I'd learned something essential. Strength isn't staying. Strength is knowing when to walk away. And the message I'd left on that mirror wasn't revenge. It was the truth, plain and undeniable, written in words Daniel could no longer ignore or minimize or laugh away. The red lipstick still sat in my bathroom drawer, a reminder of the moment I chose myself. I would never wear it, didn't need to. Its purpose had been fulfilled that morning when I wrote words that changed everything. Some people might say I was too harsh, that I should have given Daniel another chance, that marriage requires forgiveness and compromise and patience. But those people weren't the ones who'd spent 8 years being the punchline, weren't the ones who'd been called a youthful mistake by the person who promised to love them, weren't the ones who'd systematically erased themselves to make room for someone else's ambition. I'd made my choice, and for the first time in 8 years, it was mine alone. So tell me, did I handle this the right way, or should I have stayed and tried harder to fix what he broke? Was walking away strength or selfishness? If you want to hear more stories like this, about moments when silence speaks louder than words, when walking away takes more courage than staying, when choosing yourself feels revolutionary, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. Tell me about the moment you chose your dignity over someone else's comfort. I'll be reading